I appreciate you all coming out. Normally my role is to introduce the introducer. So we'll skip that portion. But as I said, I appreciate you being here. Given a number of conversations that we've been having on campus related both to strategic planning, conversations that we've had in different circles related to what has been labeled strategic curricular planning, and a number of other conversations also in terms of who we are as an institution, what our identity is, what the marketplace is. I think all of those things were good reason for us to have at least a drive-by conversation about what it means to be a liberal arts institution and sort of the context behind that. So I appreciate you being part of that conversation. At this point, I have worked in liberal arts colleges for about a quarter of a century. During that time at some of the best colleges and universities in the country, including Illinois Wesleyan. And I've heard faculty, students, and alumni struggle with a definition or even a consistent description of what a liberal arts education is. It's been a moving target throughout history and across institutions. However, as we undertake a revision of our strategic plan, it would be helpful to achieve a common understanding of what it is we do. Our identity shapes how we plan, and it may affect with whom we compete. Frank and Michael's workshop last week, I think, was interesting to a number of people because one of the things that we identified is that our cross-applicant institutions are primarily not liberal arts institutions. They are large, some private, like Loyola, Notre Dame, some public, like ISU and the University of Illinois. Well, those are institutions that are dramatically different from us. And one of the things that we may be wanting to think about is how we talk about ourselves may affect not only remaining engaged with the students who are applying at those institutions, but also making sure that the pool of applicants that are looking at institutions of our ken also recognize the appropriate language and the ways that we identify ourselves so that they don't miss the opportunity of considering us as an option. And so that's important to tap into a potentially deeper applicant pool. 8 years ago, I was speaking at the equivalent of a fall faculty conference, and I said the following sentence. Among our own faculty, the term liberal arts has been recently used to describe the general education program, courses within the humanities and social sciences, and those courses that are, quote, not vocational. What's interesting is I've heard each of those sentences within the last 4 weeks on this campus as well. So when I say we struggle sometimes with what we mean by this, that can be really pervasive throughout our institutions. And part of that is because the nature of our institutions has changed over time, even during the time that those of us in the room have been part of this process. But I would like to actually dash the idea of the vocational. I mean, vocare is what we are called to do. That should be the absolute foundation. It's different from pre-professional technical training, but there may be some important values in that in terms of the ways that it informs the way we approach the liberal arts as well. Nationally, only 8% of undergraduate students graduate with a liberal arts degree. And I specify degree because I'm not convinced that a number of institutions calling themselves liberal arts colleges are providing legitimate liberal arts educations. But likewise, it's important to note that there's a significant number of students who are graduating from large, faceless public institutions who are getting great liberal educations as well. So we need to be careful in terms of how we think about some of these programs. There's some wonderful honors colleges within large universities that do truly remarkable things. But I think I'd like to start with a paradigm that I think we can all agree upon, which is that a liberal arts education is broad-based and holistic. For those of you that don't like the holistic word, it's going to happen 3 times today. It prepares students to be critical, independent thinkers, and it ideally positions them to be successful lifelong learners capable of appreciating a diversity of viewpoints and to be engaged participants in civic discourse. And all of those things go back to the very foundations of the history of education. We're going to look at a couple of different topics today, some classical foundations, a few highlights from U.S. educational history that I hope you'll find interesting. I find them interesting. Talk about some of the relationships between liberal education and the founding fathers of the United States. Also talk a little bit about the dynamic differences between liberal education and something that is unique to this country, or was unique to this country for a long time, which is the thing we call the liberal arts college. That is a thing. It's interesting now if you, for example, I was just a couple of weeks ago at the Council of Independent Colleges annual CAOs meeting. At that meeting there were 3 CAOs from the American University of Bulgaria, the American University of some stand. And there are quite a few of them, and in fact what these are little American model liberal arts colleges that are living in countries around the world, because there is a population, often expats, but there's a population that recognizes the very specific values related to this kind of tradition. And we also see, Mark will corroborate this absolutely, places like Hong Kong who are changing the curriculum throughout the entire system to benefit from some of the things that they see are intrinsically valuable about that model. The Hong Kong universities have decided to go from a 3-year sort of British traditional model to a 4-year model, and the extra year is the stuff that we generally think of as being sort of the foundations of a liberal education, with an interesting tincture of sort of that Confucian / whole person teaching, which is great because this is their model. But they're looking at institutions like us to be role models for them at a time when people in our own nation are questioning the value of what we're doing. What they've recognized is that they have a workforce that has been highly trained for jobs that often don't exist a few years later, and also people who aren't able to move up within organizations because they don't have the critical thinking and analytical skills that we focus on in our curriculum to help them become leaders in their own organizations. So some of the things that we'll also be thinking about are some of the creative tensions between broadly and deeply. Often when we talk about liberal education, we talk about a broad-based foundation with an in-depth look at the thing that we call the major. That doesn't happen in every institution, incidentally. There's also an important thing about what is the relationship about which of these things informs the other. Is the context something that helps us to appreciate the focus, or is the focus a lens through which we can in fact understand the context? And that's important because we have, I think, at this institution some unique opportunities to exploit a two-way street in some ways that really are, I think, pretty special. It's also interesting in terms of thinking about what this liberal arts college thing is. You often hear me inciting the Annapolis group, which is sort of the club of the 128 private residential liberal arts colleges that are sort of, with a few exceptions, it's sort of the best of those institutions. I mean, the few exceptions being a few who don't participate that are very good. Not casting aspersions against the membership itself. They're all lovely people and great schools. But one thing that was interesting is a little while ago, some of the conversations that we have about our curriculum and defining ourselves, I thought it was a little interesting, so I went into the catalog. And I thought, all right, let's see where we all went to school. Because I'll tell you, the first Annapolis group meeting I attended 11 years ago, I made a comment that I thought was a completely reasonable comment to some of my colleagues, that one of the challenges in helping new faculty members adjust to teaching at our institutions was when we had faculty members who came to our institutions who had not had a liberal arts college experience. And that sometimes that culture shift was challenging. And it was if I had said something incredibly inappropriate at my grandmother's dining room table. They couldn't believe that I could have said this thing. That conversation now would be filled with nods. In fact, we had a little meeting with a group of about 30 of us, and that was part of our conversation about how the marketplace of where faculty come from has changed in a lot of ways, so that folks that are wanting to teach at places like this, where they have an intimate relationship with a small group of undergraduate students where they're focused on teaching, is a draw often to people who didn't have that experience themselves, as opposed to a number of you who in fact came back to sort of the experience that had shaped your own education. But what's interesting at this institution, if you eliminate alumni of Illinois Wesleyan, because that doesn't count, only 17 of you attended Annapolis Group schools, so about 10%. And about 5 others attended small residential liberal arts colleges that aren't part of that. So it's actually a minority in terms of you're not reproducing a culture that was your own. And I'm one of you. I mean, I went to a state university, I was in a school of music, so I'm not casting aspersions, but it does have something to do with sort of a culture and the ways in which we come to this experience as the faculty shaping the curriculum, that we're not necessarily repeating our own experiences in certain ways. It's also kind of interesting that it occurred to me that another thing to think about, because today is the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, and thinking about the line, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, is an interesting sort of allegory for the idea that Lincoln says, we had a theory, the founding fathers proposed, and at this point we're putting it into action. Now, it would be another, 105 years until every legal barrier for racism was eliminated, and we still haven't gotten past that socially, but at least legally we have. And it would be 62 years until women were voting. So there are some interesting issues, but this is the point where rather than saying we have an ideal as a nation, we had sort of taken into action a theory and applied it. But it's interesting because the theory of that democratic republic really did come out of the liberal education of the founding fathers. So also in a point when we start talking about combining application with theory, it's nice to see that we also as a nation, we do that, and also because we had a meeting yesterday where someone said, I hope someone's going to mention the Gettysburg Address today. So, all right, Greeks. Nancy, we like the Greeks, right? Good. All right. Fairly recently, as in about 18 years ago or 20 years ago, during a cultural literacy movement, you may all remember the Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, E.D. Hirsch provided a definition of liberal education as the areas of learning that cultivate general intellectual ability rather than technical or professional skills. The liberal arts is often used as a synonym for humanities, although the liberal arts also include the sciences. The term liberal comes from the Latin liberalis, meaning suitable for a free man as opposed to a slave. And this foundation ends up being, when we start looking at the curriculum of the classics, it really continues to be a model that goes up until about the Second World War in our own country. But there's an interesting shift from, rather than just being the education for citizens as opposed to slaves, of the original liberal education, the Stoics, in fact, sort of turned the table a little bit and said that a liberal education is the thing that makes us free. And that, I think, is an important mind shift. We have a couple of different approaches to how we think and who was educated in what ways. The techne, from which we get technical terms, were skills, mechanical arts, and I put music there, even though music's going to pop up in a different place, because I'm actually going to use my discipline to show sort of a division of the ways in which these things have been approached historically. But the slave servant class was taught the techne. Phronesis, or practical wisdom, was critical thinking and the foundations of what one needed to have to be an engaged and an effective citizen within the citizenry of the time. And then Sophia is more of those sort of, is there God, big giant picture things that we think about, but are not so much related to being applied. And phronesis is really carefully defined by Aristotle and some of the Aristotelian ways of looking at teaching and learning. There, partway through the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about the ways in which education helps to prepare one to participate in the polis, and he also sets up those of you who get that far to read the politics, because it's the next step in the conversation. But in fact, if we were to think about this, our motto would be episteme and phronesis, if we were thinking of scientia et sapientia in terms of sort of that balance of knowledge and wisdom. The classical liberal arts were divided into the trivium and the quadrivium. Grammar looked at how things were symbolized. Some people will actually say the way we write, the way we think, the way we speak, maybe, but certainly communication, symbolizing, and how we know things. And then Plato would say that the great preparation for philosophy is the quadrivium, looking at arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Well, how is it that with the classical liberal education we get music, and it also ended up showing up there for what we have the slave class doing? What's the difference?
Performance and composition?
It'll get that way eventually. We're even snobbier at this time. This is really more physics. It's, let's hang out with Pythagoras and the monochord calculating the ratios of pitches and, the sophisticated mental work of it, but certainly not the performance because, well, heaven forfend. Eventually on this model, we developed the medieval universities, which sprung out of cathedral and monastic schools. And these were places where canon law was taught, also logic continued, disputation and homiletics, and surprise, surprise, back in the Middle Ages, we were teaching accounting. Who had the treasury? The church. So they had that. We wandered into a guild model, where the magistorum were the faculty, and the scholarium were the students. Those of you that like the little petit écolier cookies, the little schoolboy cookies with the chocolate on them, left over from the scholarium. But that same model of the guild is why we wear the robes that we do, and how we have all the ornaments that indicate the different levels that we've achieved, and then working through that. And then a little shout out in the Middle Ages, Pope Gregory IX and the Parens Scientiarum, which was a papal bull. For those of you who've got your red book under your pillow, and I already told Jorg I was going to mention this today, this is a moment where the Pope says to his alma mater, the University of Paris, you have autonomy over your curriculum and the church can't meddle with what you teach. So we've had fights for academic freedom won all the way to the Pope back in the 13th century. Some of the early schools and sort of when they were founded, just for context, anyone know what that institution is that was on the poster? That's the main portal to Paris 4, also known as the Sorbonne, Paris 4, and a number of those leading institutions. But let's cross the pond now. And the first of the secondary schools in the colonies was Boston Public Latin, still in existence today. We've got a little model of what it apparently looked like back in the early 17th century. Also, from my perspective, the alma mater of Leonard Bernstein. I don't really know what he learned there except to be a good student. But our first college or university is Harvard. Was established in 1636 and awarded its first bachelor's degree in 1642. There was another university being planned at a time earlier than this, and there are some arguments that it even began to consolidate, but it didn't take its final official form until 1693, and that's the College of William and Mary. They altered their curriculum somewhat by breaking it up into three pieces, which were moral philosophy, natural philosophy, sort of a take on the trivium and quadrivium, and divinity. And as part of its original founding, also there had been an anticipation of providing education for the Native American population as well. And this is the backside of the Wren building, which is a fascinating building because, first of all, it's still there, but this is Christopher Wren who rebuilt London. And also, apparently, his first building ever was what was my dormitory at Trinity at Oxford. It was a horrible building. He hadn't learned how to do things yet, but it was fun to say he lived in it. These are referred to as the colonial colleges. In the instances where you have a double date, which is only a few of them, it has to do with incorporations versus founding dates. And we see a few things like the collegiate school suddenly becomes Yale when Eliyahu Yale provides it with the appropriate funds, or some instances like King's College that during the Revolution you really didn't want to name it King's anymore, so we'll honor Columbus instead, which seems like a good plan, and same with Queen's College becoming Rutgers. But these, if you hear people referring to the colonial colleges, these were the institutions that had been established prior to it and incorporated before the Revolution. But a number of other early schools that may have existed in slightly different ways. King William's School in the 20th century becomes St. John's College. Bethlehem Female Seminary in the 19th century becomes Moravian College, which is Mike Young's alma mater, I believe. Augusta Academy became Washington and Lee, sort of an interesting balance. It was on property that had been surveyed by George Washington, was named to honor him, and then perhaps its greatest president was Robert E. Lee following the Civil War, and served with great distinction, and upon his death the following day, the college board of trustees renamed the institution. But all of these institutions, I love that little girls' school, which is Salem College in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is part of a Moravian settlement. So obviously, one of the things in Moravians were very dedicated to providing quality education to the women in their communities, and we see that continuing. And Hampden Sydney College, which was actually founded in January of 1776, but apparently not incorporated until after the Revolution. The William Penn Charter School had a number of interesting firsts because of its Quaker heritage. Founded in Philadelphia at the end of the 17th century, it was at its opening available to provide education to students from any religious background. It provided financial aid. I don't know if there was a gap in 1701, but it provided financial aid and apparently started the spiral that we find ourselves in nationally. It admitted girls. And that's a carefully chosen word because they were little people, and was open to all races before the Revolutionary War. Our universities have been primarily still ecclesiastically driven in certain ways or affiliated, but John Leverett became the first non-clergy president of Harvard at the beginning of the 18th century. John Winthrop, who was an alumnus of Harvard, was appointed to their faculty. He served as interim president for a period, but he was the first faculty member in the United States to do legitimate laboratory teaching, primarily related to physics and geology. He was one of the first people to provide somewhat accurate explanations for how earthquakes take place. But this is when we see sort of legitimate scientific teaching entering the academy in the United States. William Smith was the first provost of the College of Philadelphia, which later became Penn, and he's responsible for introducing a systematic curriculum at an institution of higher education. So the things that we wrestle with as a community regularly about what is the student experiencing from beginning to end of their collegiate experience. Smith set a bunch of this up into motion. He was hired at Penn while Franklin was still very active in the administration of Penn. He was also a member of the Church of England clergy and was arrested a number of times in Philadelphia for making extremely flagrant comments about the Quakers. He seemed particularly vexed that they weren't more hawkish in terms of the war with England, and left for a period of time to go out to Maryland, where he served as the first president and sort of founder of Washington College out on the outer peninsula of Maryland, which prides itself as being, quote, the first college founded in the United States, because it was the first incorporated college after we had established ourselves as a nation. And after the Quakers had forgiven him and things had died down a little bit, he ultimately returned back to Penn and served as chief academic officer again. 1776, in December, Phi Beta Kappa was founded at the College of William and Mary. As seems to be a tradition in higher education, 5 young men met at a tavern. And they enjoyed a little bit of adult libations and debated the topic of whether French politics was more injurious than New England Rome, and whether William the Norman had the right to invade England. Chapters were established at both Harvard and Yale 3 years later. The Harvard men debated whether Adam had a navel. I believe some of them are still debating that. And the Yale men questioned whether women were intellectually equal to men, but they, of course, were frightened to ask the question whether they were intellectually greater than men. But we'll leave that for another day. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences was founded in 1780. Its founders included, and this begins sort of the relationship of the founding fathers and learned societies and education. John Adams, John Hancock, and James Bowdoin, the namesake for Bowdoin College in Maine, were 3 of the founders, and 2 of the first inductees were George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Of course, we had a member of the American Academy on campus speaking yesterday, so still continuing today. Thinking about the Founding Fathers and the relationships to education, Thomas Jefferson, an alumnus of William and Mary, founds the University of Virginia. Many students there still refer to it as Mr. Jefferson's University. John Adams, as I mentioned a moment ago, a founder of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Benjamin Franklin, a founder of Penn, at that point the College of Philadelphia. These are 3 of the 5 authors of the Declaration of Independence, Roger Sherman being the next. After he retired from public life, he went back to academic life, served both as the treasurer of Yale and as a distinguished faculty member in religion. And the 5th of the authors was Robert Livingston, who did hold the title chancellor, but that was actually a legal position in the state of New York, but was an incredibly learned figure with one of the largest private libraries, about 4,000 volume library, and quite dedicated to the life of the mind. George Washington was the sponsor of the founding of Washington College, which we mentioned recently. Patrick Henry was the founder of Hampden-Sydney College, also mentioned a moment ago. Alexander Hamilton was a trustee at, I believe it was called Herkimer Academy at the time, which upon his death was renamed in his honor as Hamilton College. And James Madison succeeded Thomas Jefferson as the rector of the University of Virginia, and George Wythe, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, was the first law professor in the United States, taught at the College of William and Mary, and among his students were Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, John Marshall, and James Monroe. Not a bad, you look at the, who did I teach during my career? Not a bad batting average. We began to see the rise of technical schools at the very end of the 18th century, the École Polytechnique in Paris, which you can see the gate there, being sort of the first of them in the United States. The Lyceum in Gardner, Maine, established a 2-year technical program for the training of farmers and mechanics, so the beginning of the A&T tradition early in the 19th century. 2 years later, RPI didn't have a hockey team yet, but they became the first U.S. engineering and technical school in Troy, over on the banks in Troy, New York. As we pray for a sound mind and a sound body, we'll see that the rise of the Sunday school tradition happens in the 1830s, and incidentally also dissections become legal in Massachusetts, and we begin to see medical schools actually being able to do the things they need. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Now we see one of the most profound influences, I think, in terms of shaping the way that American education was perceived and the role that it played. Ralph Waldo Emerson gave the Phi Beta Kappa speech in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1837, which has become the name of Phi Beta Kappa's journal, which is the American Scholar. And it has some remarkably sexist language in some of it, but in a lot of ways it really sort of established a mindset of an intellectual tradition for the United States. And Oliver Wendell Holmes called it our intellectual Declaration of Independence. 3 principal issues in this were, first of all, man's relationship to nature. In terms of how he observes and reports upon it. Second was his relationship with books, that is building, standing on the shoulders of giants, the ways in which our relationship with literature and thinking of the past shapes where we are, and that the scholar is a person of action. He says, there goes in the world a notion that the scholar should be a recluse, a valetudinarian, as unfit for any handiwork or public labor as a penknife for an axe. The so-called practical men sneer at speculative men, as if, because they speculate or see, they could do nothing. Action is with the scholar subordinate, but it is essential. Without it, he is not yet man. Without it, thought can never ripen into truth. Whilst the world hangs before the eye as a cloud of beauty, we cannot even see its beauty. Inaction is cowardice, but there can be no scholar without the heroic mind. The preamble of thought, the transition through which it passes from the unconscious to the conscious, is action. And then the last section, which is not numbered, is when he outlines what the duties of the scholar are within his community. His model was Goethe, a person who was engaged in the arts and literature, a person who was engaged in natural history and scientific observation, and a person who was espousing ways of thinking and acting within his community. And now we have the liberal arts versus the liberal arts college. A couple of weeks ago in a fun conversation with one of my colleagues, I was asking the question, are we a liberal arts college? With the idea of just, let's come up with good language for it. But I have to show you that we have to be. Because on the Annapolis Group webpage, where it says, welcome to the Annapolis Group, our own Dr. He is the photograph for the liberal arts advantage. Isn't that great? I sort of stumbled across it. He didn't even know it was there. So, but there is this tradition of a kind of institution which is uniquely American, and it is built upon the ideals of the Transcendentalists. Growing out of the inspiration of Emerson, which is this small, residential, undergraduate institution based upon the interconnectedness of broad-based education and a deep experience within a discipline or disciplines in which the residential community becomes, in fact, a learning community, and that residential experience and the relationships between members of that community are an integral part of the entire education, the whole student approach to thinking, and that critical thinking and phronesis are the foundation of the curriculum and the goals of the faculty and the students. Around the time that these institutions are developing and taking their shape, we also see the tent finally opening up a bit. Emma Willard. Paul, you were showing me a book about Emma Willard a while ago. She opens the Emma Willard School, which is a school for young women in 1821. Oberlin admits black students upon its opening in 1833. Mary Lyons, who was a great leader and the founder of Rebecca's alma mater, Mount Holyoke. Go Lions. Although Oberlin, always wanting to be sort of the forefront, said, they got women, we got women. A year later, they went co-ed, and we're sort of leading the way. My wife said, don't throw in a bunch of pictures of your previous institution, but just so you know, there were schools, this is the library where I taught last, that were playing lacrosse over 80 years ago. That's a lacrosse stick, and for 1 week on this campus in the spring, I will be one of the few people that knows more about the sport than everyone else, and then you'll all catch up. But the first intercollegiate athletic contest, 1852, between Harvard and Yale, and it was a boat race. The Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States is founded in 1905. This is now the NCAA. And yet, not until 1981 do we see women fully officially recognized within its governance. But this is also one of the reasons for years and years that women's colleges were leaders in women's athletics. Because 100 years ago, it was not uncommon for a lacrosse team or a field hockey team to be competing between colleges and universities through the relationship of the Women's College Network, which at that time was about 300 or so. There are, I think, 53 remaining, and 3 men's colleges, incidentally. And then we have the change of public support for education. There, 1867, the New York State Legislature provides free public school for the entire state. This is a major shift, but even a few years before that, we've got the Morrill Land Grant Act. And anybody know where that started? And Laurie is not allowed to answer. Well, a political movement started coming around in the 1830s asking to provide agricultural education more broadly. And there was a guy named Jonathan Baldwin Turner who was on the faculty of Illinois College, just down the road in Jacksonville. Is Jacksonville, right? Yeah, got one right. Okay. Who first proposed this idea in 1853. The Illinois legislature adopted a resolution which he had drafted calling for the Illinois congressional delegation to work to enact a land grant bill system to provide industrial colleges, one for each state in the country. So the birthplace is here. Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois believed it was advisable that the bill should be introduced by an Eastern congressman to be successful. So he contacted Justin Morrill from Vermont. I had always thought it was a Vermont idea, but in fact it had come from here. And part of it was that they felt that the Eastern representation would have some more sway. And one of the things that Morrill did that changed the original model was that he moved the funding level to be based upon the representation to Congress, rather than being equitable between states. And that was one of the things that helped to build more support. And yet, when it went in front of James Buchanan, it was vetoed in 1857. In 1861, Morrill resubmitted the act with an amendment that said that they would also teach military tactics and engineering as well as agriculture. And because the secession was falling on its heels and much of the opposition that Buchanan had feared was coming from southern states, Lincoln then signed it into act, and we had the foundation of our public land-grant universities. This was not a land-grant university. This is the University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's university, and the land-grant university in Virginia is Virginia Tech. What is important here is, as I mentioned, 8% of the population are attending liberal arts colleges now. What's interesting is that there was a point in time in the 1950s when they were at parity. That liberal education and other kinds of education were basically at parity, and public and private were at parity. But with sort of in the shadow of the GI Bill and a number of other changes that took place in the middle of the century, the public portion of the college-bound population grew exponentially. So at that point, there were 1 million each, private and public, and within sort of a generation, it was 13 million and 3. And so we have, so actually the sort of representation within the population remains about the same, but the set is dramatically different. All right, the Chautauqua movement. I was actually the bell captain of this during college, of this hotel. The Chautauqua movement began in 1874. John Hyle Vincent, who was the Methodist bishop of the Diocese of Cleveland, Ohio, and Lewis Miller, who was incidentally Thomas Edison's father-in-law, and an inventor himself. Lewis Miller, among other things, made the first commercial dishwasher and the first prefabricated house, which he made to ship to Chautauqua. They decided that they would create a camp for the training of Sunday school teachers, because for many people in this country beyond the age of about 4th or 5th grade, the only continuing education available was through Sunday schools. And so they thought that it was important to provide broad-based education to people through that venue, because they thought continuing education was important. President Grant spoke at the second year, and then they created this home study course, which attracted 100,000 people by 1877. 1879, the Chautauqua Normal School of Languages is founded, and their press would have 93 titles in print within just a decade of the founding, and there were Chautauquas, some of which still exist under these names, in 30 states, in addition to the touring Chautauquas, which is a whole different thing. It's fascinating that what became a church camp with people on tents on platforms within 10 years was an entire community of ornate Victorian gingerbread cottages and a pretty remarkable non-sectarian center for American intellectualism in just a few years. A number of the tent Chautauquas provided arts and philosophical lectures to people in all areas of the United States, but a number of the tent Chautauquas were really just vaudeville shows with the name Chautauqua stuck on them as well. But they also founded this thing called the CLSC, or the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. During the summer of 1879, this was formed, and it was a 4-year course of study of home reading. It was the first organized reading circle in the country. It was a Victorian MOOC. The Chautauquan was published as an anthology of course readings old and new, and its charter stated, "This new organization aims to promote habits of reading and study in nature, art, science, and in secular and sacred literature in connection with the routine of daily life, especially among those whose educational advantages have been limited, so as to secure to them the college student's general outlook upon world and life, and to develop the habit of close, connected, persistent thinking. This process, you were expected to read the books during the year and during the summer come back to Chautauqua to have in-depth conversations. There were examinations, and at the end of the 4-year cycle you received a certificate. This still happens today. One of the things that's different today is they're often reading bestsellers, and a number of the conversations are being led by the authors of those books. But this also became the foundation for the continuing education program at the University of Chicago, and in many ways opened up the Great Ideas curriculum that would be celebrated there a little bit later. We've got the rise of pragmatism. We've got Charles Peirce and William James as sort of the Harvard boy pragmatists who are looking at the practical applications of knowledge and thinking as being a fundamental aspect, and it shapes the ways in which American colleges and universities, primarily universities, approach their curricula, and it also ends up leading us into more and more of what will be sort of the foundations of the expert. And John Dewey, another one of the great American pragmatists, is known to us primarily in this conversation as one of the great leaders of changes in American higher education and in the education of school children, but also with Arthur Lovejoy and Franz Boas and a few other folks. Dewey was the founder of the AAUP. And what's interesting is that some of the things that prompted the AAUP into happening, Dewey originally had thoughts of it as being sort of like the American Bar Association or the American Medical Association. But there were a number of instances in which academic freedom had been challenged in interesting ways. Wendell Barrett had spoken out against, or had spoken in favor of workers' right to strike at the University of Wisconsin, and was subjected basically to the equivalent of a trial on campus. In 1895, Edward Bemis was forced to resign from the University of Chicago because he spoke in support of the Pullman strike and against monopolies. And who was the #1 supporter of the University of Chicago at the beginning of the 20th century? John D. Rockefeller. And then Edward Ross was forced to resign by Jane Stanford for some remarks that now we would find pretty offensive, but at the time, the context would have been different. But at the time that he was forced to resign, 7 members of the econ faculty at Stanford resigned, and as a result of that, Lovejoy moved, and then was sort of called to arms in terms of defending academic freedom by Dewey, and that helped to lead us to the establishment of the AAUP. What's interesting is that Dewey didn't think that much of their work would be spent on academic freedom cases, and there were 31 cases in the very first year of the organization's existence. John Erskine is sort of the founder of the Great Ideas curriculum. In 1917, he proposed the creation of a 2-year classics in translation program at Columbia, where basically every week you would read a classic in translation, have a conversation about it. The faculty rejected it because they felt that reading deeply and slowly, which is certainly a good thing as well, was important. He thought that if these were texts that spoke to the people of their time in meaningful ways, that being exposed to the broad spectrum of them and getting an idea of that backdrop of ideas would be of great value. They said, no, won't work. So he went over after the First World War and actually applied this through a YMCA program in post-war France with American troops. It was incredibly successful. So he brought back the responses from that. And the Columbia faculty decided to approve it in 1921. And a number of students in that program who came out with that, Richard McEwen, Stringfellow Barr, Scott Buchanan, and Mortimer Adler were some of the early students of that program. And we'll see how they disseminated the model of this in different ways in which they shaped curriculum. First of all, we've got Robert Hutchins here, who was president of the University of Chicago, and he hired Mortimer Adler to come out and reproduce the Columbia program with the 2-year Great Ideas program at the University of Chicago. And as president of the university, co-taught the class with Adler for about 20 years. And there were some remarkable things because they would also bring in these fantastic guests. Lillian Gish, Orson Welles, Gertrude Stein would just make guest appearances at the Great Ideas classes at the University of Chicago. And eventually, this Great Ideas program got shifted into that berth created by the CLSC and became a continuing education program. The Columbia program still exists. 3 weeks ago, the guy who runs it was sitting right behind me at a meeting. And it's a vital program that some students elect to take. Then we have Stringfellow Barr, who thankfully didn't want to pursue a career in male modeling, but was quite a good academe. I can't believe they let that photo up, but that's the only one I can find. King William School in Annapolis, Maryland, it was on the verge of closing, and Barr and Buchanan, Barr at that point had found his way to the University of Virginia, and Buchanan was the dean at the University of Chicago. They said, we got an idea, we're just start a whole new kind of curriculum, and either it's going to work or it isn't. And they created the Great Books curriculum at what had been King William's School, now St. John's College in Annapolis, and a great idea was born. Now, with St. John's, as many of you know, there are no majors, there are no departments. There is a shared curriculum among all of the students, which is reading deeply and discussing the classical foundations of the various disciplines in which we live and work. This is my favorite and least favorite curriculum for various reasons. It's much more my favorite. But there are some real problems with the St. John's model. Now, Chris Nelson, who's the president there and has been there for ages, is a friend of mine. Every time he talks about anything, I get excited. But when he talks about the curriculum, the classes he teaches there, it's absolutely intoxicating to think about just doing math with Euclid for a semester. But there's some interesting problems because it's a curriculum that's based upon keeping your eye in the rearview mirror. It builds a huge and wonderful foundation, but art history did not end with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I mean, this painting would be on the Antiques Roadshow. It's 106 years old. But because of sort of the nature of the way the curriculum works, doing the Cavendish lab experiments is a great way to learn some things about physics. But once again, it's a century behind us. And so there's the whole idea of students being so lucky to be at institutions like this where we complement a foundation with actually seeking and creating new knowledge in the ways that scholars and the people who created the classics upon which their curriculum is based work. And so the whole idea of being looking forward and backward together, I think, is incredibly important. We have an organization called the Association for Core Texts and Courses. This was founded at Temple in 1995. Scott Lee is its leader. There are about 70 or 80 schools that participate, and these are schools that either, like St. John's, have a corpus of texts that is the entire foundation of their curriculum, or they have first-year seminars that share texts, or they, in some cases like Columbia, have an alternate curriculum that embraces a particular set of texts. For example, I saw a presentation about 4 weeks ago with faculty who were teaching in the first-year seminars at Lawrence, at Rhodes, and at Ursinus. And these are faculty from across the institution who, teaching like a gateway, are all teaching the same texts together. And every one of them said that it was the best faculty development that they'd had because there was an evolutionary biologist that said, having a conversation with my colleagues in religion helps me so much to think about ways that I can teach the Gita to a group of first-year students who are struggling with a new text, with me struggling with them alongside them, and the ways in which I deal with an information and model the scholar encountering some of the same obstacles is incredibly valuable to them. And so there's that way of not always being the expert, but then also having this community of every student at the institution wrestling with these same ideas and texts as a shared intellectual experience. I mentioned the program at Columbia before, but then also St. Bonaventure University in Wesleyan, New York, has an interesting program. Its classics program has some shared text throughout the time that it's there, but they begin with one of St. Bonaventure's books, which I always am thinking of the Peregrines. That's not what it is. Oh, it's right there. The Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, or the Journeys of the Mind of God. They read this during their first semester, and at various times throughout their experience in the 4 years that they're enrolled at the institution, they go back and use that particular text as a lens for looking at different texts and different ideas within their curriculum. As sort of, our institution is named for a particular Franciscan scholar, and using that as a way of looking at different aspects of our learning is a fulcrum upon which we can build what we're doing. Hampden-Sydney College, which was mentioned a couple of times before, one of the remaining 3 men's colleges. I've got about 5 minutes and I'll be done, I promise you. But an incredibly fixed curriculum, an incredibly conservative curriculum. 3 semesters of rhetoric is required. They used to have rhetoric taught by faculty across the institution. They now have, every faculty member does some rhetoric teaching, but they have a specific rhetoric faculty that steer that program. They take 3 semesters of Western culture. It's a very Western curriculum, although they have recently added some non-Western programs. They have to take 2 semesters of American studies. And I think it was 8 years ago, they added a fine arts requirement. That really killed them to do that. They did. And the one thing that is true is that the young men that graduate from this institution write very well. If there's a single thing that their faculty want to be sure they can do, is critical thinking learned through the process of argumentation and writing. And so they've decided this is our hallmark. They've got 1,000 18-year-old men who are being dragged through Rhetoric 1 or not that, sorry, that's the entire population, but about 300 at a time. Okay, now a little autobiography. I actually taught at Hampden-Sydney for a year as a sabbatical replacement, and going back to that model of the techne music versus the phronesis music a while ago, there was an English faculty member there named Amos Lee Lane, a lovely guy, and he was part of my interview process, and I didn't know at the time he was a really good pianist. And he just sort of set up things and said, well, if you come here to teach for a year, and it was introductory courses in directing the Glee Club and a pep band, and they weren't very peppy, but they were good guys. He said, now, Jonathan, it's important for you to understand that it's critical for a young Southern gentleman to be knowledgeable about music and the arts. Sorry, Frank, this is pretty But he mustn't become proficient because this is what he hires others to do for him. And I got it. And if you look at a number of our institutions, even to this day, there are major research universities where the music department is in the College of Arts and Sciences and includes the PhD people who do history and theory and sometimes composition. And then there are the others. Sometimes they're not even listed as faculty. They have some term, and they're the ones that teach piano lessons and what have you. And this ancient historic divide that Plato set down for us is still shaping even the staffing of major research universities in the 21st century. I had a student that I sent off to a musicology program. I warned her at one of the best universities in this country, and I said, if you persist through the PhD portion of your graduate program, they won't let you play. And eventually it was true. And she sent a resignation letter from her graduate program, walked away with the MA, enrolled in a computer science program at another university and said, I'm going to study computer science and get my PhD in Indiana because they'll let me play the piano. Interesting how. Okay, this is a quote from the New York Times that shows that there's been a real shift in terms of what our students think is important about a college education. And a lot of this also, there was another study that was parallel to this of the number of people that said they came to college to establish a personal philosophy in 1960, and in 1990 the number stayed the same, but it was 1/5 of as big in terms of the slice of the pie. So there were much more people who were looking for a better job rather than developing a personal philosophy, but that constant group are the people that are 8% student body in many cases. Okay, this is the last little bit of the autobiography. A number of times you have all heard me make some quip that I didn't have a liberal arts education and I've been trying to catch up ever since. In a sense, this is true. As an undergraduate student, I was in a training program to be an opera singer. But even then, I was required to take a general education program not significantly different from many liberal arts colleges. The difference was that had ensembles received credit at Fredonia, my alma mater, which they do virtually everywhere else, my major had 98 credit hours in it. That's 24 and a half units of my degree would have been in the major. Many of the students believed, and our faculty reinforced, that our general education courses were an inconvenience that took us out of the practice room. Strangely enough, in hindsight though, the richest holistic education I received was actually within the School of Music. While music was the center of the curriculum, much of what we learned had other things to do with the forces in shaping ideas of our art. We learned physics through acoustics. We learned physiology through pedagogy classes. We learned literature through the texts that we were singing. We learned design and history and philosophy, all in service of the discipline. But we were engaged in it, and we had a way of looking at it that was incredibly meaningful and informative. Stranger still was that the most unified and Catholic of my educational experiences was my doctorate, where we were looking at orchestral and choral conducting, religious doctrine, social history, liturgical traditions, kinesthetics, philosophy, acoustics, contract law were part of the curriculum. And what I think is really curious, Otto Klemperer, anybody know Otto Klemperer? One of the great conductors of the 20th century, and actually his great-granddaughter graduated from here at our last commencement, Anna. Some of you who? His son is Werner Klemperer, who played Colonel Klink on Hogan's Heroes. But Otto Klemperer was one of the great musicians, and he said that the best preparation for a conductor was a degree in philosophy and a job as an opera coach in an opera house. And he had a really good point, because he recognized the importance of a complete education of both theory and practice in the ways that they inform each other. And I'd like to close with thinking about that just a little bit. What is it that distinguishes this institution? When I'm talking to my colleagues who do what I do from other institutions, and I explain the role of the professional schools and the professional programs on this campus, they're unusual because of how long they've been here. We keep seeing colleges and universities that add pre-professional schools as a way of dealing with enrollment challenges. Our newest pre-professional program is 50 years old. We created a school of nursing because we thought it was important both to serve the community and to produce liberally educated nurses. We created a school of music 149 years ago for the very same reason. School of art, the business program is 90 years old. These are not reactionary curricula. They're curricula that were set up to serve our students, to serve our community, and to build upon a foundation of liberal education that was the core of the institution. But because we're unusual in terms of being in many ways very much a traditional liberal arts college with a preponderance of pre-professional programs compared to our peer group, those of you that looked at my charts will notice there are some of them where we're one of 4 or 5 schools that has this and one of 3 or 4 schools that have that. If you look at the entire constellation of pre-professional programs on this campus, we are a unique institution among liberal arts colleges. But we also have this incredible opportunity both to continue the tradition that we have in terms of how liberal education prepares people in those professions to be broadly prepared to be active citizens within our community. But at the same point, and this goes back to the first thing we sort of did together with the ways of teaching, is that we have really wonderful ways of working with our colleagues within those programs in looking at different pedagogical approaches to what we do, and also looking at the ways that those vocational programs to which our students are called as another way of creating a lens around which we think about the liberal education experience as a hub to the thinking and how a student interprets. Not unlike what the St. Bonaventure does with its use of a St. Bonaventure text as a common lens. That we've got lots of models across this institution. I'm incredibly excited about the ways in which some of the things we're doing with the cluster classes and a number of other initiatives are creating some opportunities for us to parlay what we've got on this campus in some ways that will be remarkably attractive. to students who really want to be successful in a number of ways. And so I think our future is bright, and I appreciate you spending an hour with me today. And I know that we have treats out in the hallway. Treats out in the hallway, Patty?
Yes.
All right, good. All right. Thank you all.